So welcome to the Managing E-Resources workshop. And so today, Annie and I am Amy Deschenes. I'm the Systems and Web Application Librarian over at Beatley Library. And I'm a graduate of GISLIS, and I've worked at Beatley for almost 6 years now. And I've had some hand in managing e-resources since I started there. And Annie, do you want to kind of just introduce yourself?
My name is Annie Erdmann. I'm the E-Resources and Digital Assets Librarian at Beatley. I have been an E-Resources Librarian for about 4 years now, and I have my graduate degree is from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
All right, and I think we have 3 members of the library staff, and would you both like to introduce yourself, and we can introduce the other members of the library staff, and just if there's something you're looking to get out of the workshop, that would be great. Nothing, if you're just interested, that's fine, but you can go first.
Oh. Hey everybody, I'm Susan Allman, and I am just here today because in general I like to come to all these talks because it's my way of trying to piece together this whole thing that is LIS. So,
Great.
I guess that's just looking for one more part of the resources.
Nick, I'm a student in archives, but I can know AE stuff because E is important. I also have class tomorrow, so I'm here in there. So.
All right, cool, okay.
I'm Heather Dixon, and I work in server services at Erdmann and in the same office with Amy. And I'm here because I love hearing public on speed. There's always learning something.
I'm Jay Campbell. I'm the Access Services Librarian at Beatley. I too take care of the hearing or okay.
I'm Paul Engberg. I work in public services at the library. So this is that goes on upstairs at the library.
Cool. All right, so this talk is going to be very, very practical and very informal. So if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to interrupt. But we're kind of going to talk about 3 main things today. So first we're going to go over ERMs, which are electronic resource managers, so the software you might use to manage all of your e-resources. And we're going to talk about proprietary options that you would pay for through a vendor, and then also a couple of open source options that are available. And then next, Annie is going to go sort of delve into the world of link resolvers and A to Z lists, and she will explain what those are. There's a lot of specific terminology around these things, so if we say something that you're like, oh, I'm not quite sure what that is, please just raise your hand and let us know. Then we'll talk about different authentication methods, so how to ensure that only the people who have rights to access these resources have rights. So for instance, if you live in the state of Massachusetts, you can access Massachusetts library resources online and online databases. So how do you make that happen so someone from Oklahoma isn't accessing the Massachusetts library databases? So there's a few different ways to do that. And then we're going to pass on some good resources and sort of online journals and things we use to keep up to date with trends and changes to the world of resources. So starting with ERMs. So the best way to think about an ERM is kind of a giant database that organizes all of the information around your e-resources. And when I say e-resources, that can mean online databases, ebooks, can mean online journals. There's a lot of different things that make up the world of e-resources. So in the ERM, you're going to have vendor contact information, because all of these may be provided by different companies. Information about administrator accounts, because each of these interfaces, so say EBSCO is a vendor, ProQuest is a vendor, JSTOR is a vendor, there's going to be a different administrative interface and probably a different username and password that Annie, usually the e-resources librarian, or whomever is managing e-resources is going to need to keep track of. So if they need to log into JSTOR and change something, you're gonna go into the ERM and look up that information, because it's gonna be impossible to remember everything unless you have a photographic memory. Which, that would be a good thing to put on your resume if you were gonna be an e-resources librarian. Also keeping track of access issues. So one of the big parts of this process is any troubleshooting or errors that people experience. So sort of keeping track of those can go in the ERM. Payment history, so e-resources management is a lot different than managing sort of one-time purchases like you would in the ILS, in the acquisitions module, because you are regularly renewing and working with vendors on deciding if you're going to continue subscribing to a certain package or something, also doing negotiations. So all of that you're going to want to keep track of in the ERM. And also usage data. So statistics around, are people actually using these e-resources? Are they going in and searching? Are they actually accessing full text of the articles? Is it worth it for us to keep paying for this resource? So that's another big thing that the ERM might store. And depending on your library, you might just use certain parts of this. Like certain places might not keep as good of track of the usage data, might not put it in the ERM. Certain places, you might keep your administrator accounts in a different place. It sort of depends on the library. This is kind of like the perfect world. Everything is going to be in the ERM. All right, so there's two different types of ERMs, and I took this from an article that I'm going to reference in the resources section, just as a way to sort of talk about the way you might encounter an ERM in your job. So the first type is the ILS integrated ERM. So this is usually a module within your integrated library system that it does all of this stuff for you. So for instance, at the library when I first started there up until about a year and a half ago, we used the ERM module that was part of the Millennium ILS from Innovative Interfaces. And that was an additional charge we were paying in order to have this functionality. However, we always kind of struggled with keeping the data accurate in it. And I think there were some limitations because, Innovative, when they built Millennium, they were really thinking about managing the resources that were a one-time purchase. This was a system that was built in the 90s, so there wasn't too much e-resource management going on. If there was, it was maybe taking place in a spreadsheet or something ad hoc. And the ERM module in Millennium was kind of built on top of what already existed in Millennium, and that database was built around managing resources that were a one-time payment. And so it did work to an extent, but it wasn't the best solution for our situation. So other libraries, it might be a good solution, but for us, it was just challenging to manage e-resources using this ERM. But like I said, I'm not trying to down talk it, it's just, for us, it wasn't the right thing. So the other type of ERM is the functional product integration. So this means your ERM is grouped with other software or services that support e-resources. So for instance, this is going to integrate the ERM with the link resolver or the A to Z list or even your authentication services. And these are usually provided by vendors who also provide e-resources. So instead of being an ILS company that's providing sort of the software to manage your library, these are the same companies that also have some kind of arm that supports you paying for the journals they offer. So for instance, Serious Solutions, they're tied to ProQuest, right? So they have a product called 360 Core, which that's just the name of the software. There's a web interface where you log in and you do all your ERM data management, and they also offer 360 Link, which is their link resolver product. And then the other one, which we don't use, but we do use EBSCO for our link resolver and A to Z list, is ERM Essentials. So at Beatley, we use an open source product called Coral that Annie's going to talk about in more detail as our ERM, but we're using the EBSCO, link resolver, and A to Z list. So Andy's gonna talk a little bit more about some open source ERM options.
I'm just going back to Amy's last slide a little bit. Each one of these companies markets and kind of packages these materials in different ways. So for example, ProQuest sells 360 Core as like a whole package, but EBSCO really breaks up ERM Essentials into little bits and pieces, and we actually do purchase one part of ERM Essentials to manage all of our journal data, because we use EBSCO as our main purchasing site for our electronic journals. So it made sense to get cost-benefit analysis from the people we buy the journals from. So that can be a little bit confusing. So I always really recommend that people ask questions because everybody's different. So be sure to ask your vendor questions. So I'm going to talk about two open source ERMs. The first is Hermes. This is an open source product that's based on Microsoft Access templates. It was developed at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse by Gladriel. She is actually now the e-resources librarian at Connecticut, and she's very friendly and welcoming. So if you are investigating this for your own library, reach out to her. She loves hearing from people and talking to people about this solution. It's a really active community. When you're looking at open source products, you really want to make sure that you have an active community. You want to make sure that people are posting to the blog regularly so that if you choose this solution, you're going to have help. You're not just out there on your own. At the end, if we have time, I'll show you a map of registered users. It's actually, there are a lot of people using this product. And I would recommend it for people who are maybe a single user. So if I was the only person managing electronic resources and nobody ever really else was looking at the material. If you don't have super complicated resources, so if you're dealing with mostly journals or databases, and nothing, everything's pretty straightforward. And then if you have a smaller budget, if you're not dealing with hundreds and hundreds of items, if you have maybe 100 items total, this is a really good solution for you. And,
I was just saying, I would also add to, if you don't have a lot of technology support or technical experience, it does just rely on Microsoft Access. So you don't need to have a server where you're hosting it or any programming experience.
that's right.
So it's a good, easy to set up thing.
And if you don't know how to use Microsoft Access, this Simmons pays for access to lynda.com, and they have wonderful tutorials on how to set up an Access database. So I would really highly recommend checking that out. It's a huge resume booster if you're applying for e-resources jobs, to say, I'm familiar with Hermes, and then maybe to be able to talk about, I know how to build an Access database. I created a trial one just for myself. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the solution that we chose here at Simmons Library. We chose Coral as our open source ERM. There were a couple of decisions that led us to this choice. We liked that it was built on the SQL database. We liked that the modules inherited data from each other and talked back and forth. We also really liked that it was developed by the University of Notre Dame, and it has an extremely active network. I was actually, before I came to this library, I was on the selection board for FLOW, Fenway Libraries Online. So we were also evaluating Coral as a solution for the other consortial libraries, which is why I was familiar with it when I came here. And it really worked out because we do have technology experience. Amy's great. She built it in like a day or two. So that was really nice. It looks good. It's a clean product. We really liked that it was flexible and dynamic. We could do what we wanted. We could also have multiple users, which is really crucial in our department because we have 2 library assistants that really work with us, and they're in and out of the system at all times. So there are actually probably 4 or 5 of us in this system daily, which if you're gonna do that with Hermes, you might wanna get into quality control discussions before you start doing that. It's also hosted on a server, which is really nice for us. So I can access it from home, and I can work really easily. I like that a lot. Amy, do you have anything else?
No, I would say if you have taken the database management class here and felt like, you know, you kind of developed proficiency with SQL in that database management class, you could handle setting this up. Like, it is not, like Annie said, I'm not in any way like a master of MySQL and PHP. I have a working knowledge of it, and the documentation for this is excellent. And as Annie stated, the network, there's a listserv where you can ask questions about setting things up, is also very good. So
If you go to this website, you'll be able to log in and create a test account and tool around. I also recommend doing that. You can, if you sign up for an account and you tool around and you add things, you should definitely, again, it's a great resume booster. I'm familiar with Coral, I've played around in it, and you can talk about what the 4 modules do. That's a really big deal. So please take a look, investigate. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna switch over to link resolvers and the A to Z list. Does anyone have any questions about ERMs? The one thing I'll say before we might transition is that ERMs are huge for the field of electronic resources management. Before there was no management. People were managing things in inboxes, in their personal inboxes, or on spreadsheets, or whiteboards. Not good if you have turnover, which, you know, you do. I mean, people leave, and it's really nice to come in as an e-resources librarian and say, oh, they have a system, I don't have to start from scratch. It's a real pain to have to guess what you have in your holdings, or to guess who you're buying things from, or why you bought it. So, okay, so we're going to transition to link resolvers. Is that okay? Everybody good? Great. Okay, so a link resolver, and I've posted some links here, and when you get the presentation, please look at them. When I train new reference workers at the library, I kind of give them a little training session on these things, and some people are nodding their heads, which is good. So please take a look at these if you're interested in electronic resources management. And the way that I'll describe link resolvers are the basic technology that allows you to search in one database. So take PubMed or Lisa that has abstracts, and then you see that you don't have any full text in that database, that you see an orange Find Full Text button. As soon as you click that orange Find Full Text button, it shoots the metadata to the link resolver knowledge base, which I have populated. So I'm telling that knowledge base, these are all the things that we own and have access to. So that database shoots the metadata in to the knowledge base, and then it matches up and gives you a result saying we have full text in these locations. Or we don't have full text, here's an ILL form, and that's where Paul picks up. Okay. Again, it uses open URL technology, which is and it allows metadata to pass through, which is actually why it's really crucial to have really good metadata. with the invention of big discovery platforms, we're seeing more and more access errors coming out of metadata errors. That the information that one database is passing to the knowledge base is incorrect. So it's something to really think about when you're looking at access issues or when you're searching at home even. And the Lore of Linking is just a really great article that every librarian should read. It really helps clear things up, and I'm seeing some nodding heads, which is really good. Okay. All right. So we've talked about, from my demonstration, we've talked about the knowledge base, right? And activating library resources or open access content that you choose, okay? This is the back end. The knowledge base is the back end, and the A to Z list is your front end. For most companies, they're opposite sides of the same coin. My only caveat is EBSCO's link source is not that way. I have complained, and it should be, but it is not. Their two products were purchased separately and merged together, so it's not, and it's a little bit confusing. But in general, and we'll take a look at Serial Solutions, so I can show you what this looks like. But these two things are directly related to each other. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, great. Okay, so the Link Resolver knowledge base has three main parts in general. List of providers, vendors, the database, and the list of resources. So this is where we get into the jargon here, okay? Each product calls things different names. And it's really important when you're talking to your vendor or technical support that you're talking the same language. So even if you're, on a support call, it might be really helpful to share your screen or to have them go through and see what you're seeing, because it can be confusing. Okay, so the knowledge base is generally organized in levels. So I like to call it a box within a box within a box. And Amy found this great graphic to explain that. So you have, in your knowledge base, you have a list of providers. And then within those providers, you have a list of all the databases they offer. And then within those databases, you have resources. So each database has a huge list of titles. And this is how most link resolvers are organized. So here's a great example. EBSCO, Library and Information Science Source, Library Technology Reports. So I, as an e-resources librarian, am going to activate at every level. And I'll show you what that looks like. Ooh. Okay, here we go. Okay, so there are a lot of great examples, and if we have time, we can look at those. Actually, I might. Can I open up some of these?
Yeah.
All right.
It's like 45 after.
Oh, great, great. Okay, so here are some examples. There's lots of customizations you can do. So this is SFX, and you can kind of see that little swirly S up at the top. You can kind of see, but these are just two different schools that set up their front pages differently. So this is MIT, and this is the New England College of Optometry, which actually I set up. So there are different options. This is Suffolk. They use Serial Solutions, so they've done a lot of customization here. And this is, again, the front-facing part of the knowledge base. And then this is what ours looks like. you can see here that it's generally a list of journals, because it's full text, but often you'll have ebooks as well. So it can be a little bit confusing, but it's generally used and called like a journals list or an e-journals list or something like that. Journals A to Z, yeah. So all of these have different jargon. Target, source, service, vendor, database, resource, threshold, coverage. All of these are very confusing, and it's kind of immersion. Once you're there, you'll understand it. But I do think it's really important that you're familiar with these terms, because if you can use them and talk about them in a job interview, it's really important. It shows that you're connected, it shows that you're in the mindset, even if you aren't using the specific lingo that they're using, they'll be able to say, oh, okay, this person is with it, they kind of know what they're talking about, that's really good. A lot of the vendors also offer free tutorials. So I added one for EBSCO's WebEx channel, so you will need a WebEx viewer software downloaded to your computer, but I send my library assistants here. I basically say, I don't have time to teach you. They teach you way better than I can anyway. So I send people here a lot. Or reach out to someone. I know that Susan has been interviewing people all over town, it seems. And I actually learned how to do this from somebody at Emerson. So it's really important to reach out, get familiar, think about it, engage with it. Okay.
Okay, so moving on to authentication methods. Any questions before we move
Yeah.
on about linking, easy lists? Any ERM questions?
Well, just a question, I always use Simmons here, but I also, through my work, I have access to Harvard's portal. What should you do if sometimes there is a problem and you're looking for journal A and you go to the link resolver and something else pops up that may or may not have anything to do with what you're looking for. And I probably should know this by now, but I don't really see any place on the Simmons site where I should contact and say, I just noticed something weird here. Just email me or school. Same thing with Harvard.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's a great question. What do you do as an end user to communicate that you've hit a wall? You're lost. You didn't get to where you wanted. What we have here actively on campus is contact the reference desk. So, and I don't know how well that is communicated. And Susan, that also brings up a really great point that I wanted to talk about in terms of, you saw that all the A to Z lists look really different. You should really be engaging with your patrons and asking them and doing user experience research that Amy specializes in. Does this make sense to an end user? Does it not make sense? Does it look cool, but they don't know how to use it? So I would say at Simmons, we would say contact the reference desk and then they troubleshoot, and if they can't fix it, they bump it up to my team. But Amy and I have also been talking about maybe little tools that we can create. So I've only worked here for 2 years, but it is on our list of things we're thinking about, like a button that says, I need help, or it's broken, and then it will populate some data from you to give to us to be able to fix the issue.
When you said that the metadata is going through, is that literally the bibliographic site you would see in like a Chicago or MLA? Or is it now like a digital object serial number?
So the metadata is often given, you can often see it through the URL. So when I do training at the reference desk, my number one saying is watch the URL change. Watch and look what it's doing. when you're clicking around, see what data is being passed through. So it's not like a MARC record. It's more like the DOI.
If you're interested in understanding that a little bit more too, I would read up about OpenURL because that's the technology that allows the browser to send that information. It basically like pulls the information from whatever fields the link resolver is saying to pull from and adds it as pieces in the URL. Sometimes it's even really obvious, like T equals and then the title, and like I equals and then the ISBN. Sometimes it's not as obvious. But if you read it, even like just the Wikipedia article on OpenURL is a great place to start. So.
Yep, and I linked to it in the presentation, so when you get the link. Or you can just Wikipedia OpenURL.
Anything else? Okay. So, authentication methods. So as I said at the beginning, these are the different ways to allow access to the resource to only the people who are supposed to have access. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. A lot of places use a combination of these methods, and it can be different depending on the institution and also depending on the vendor for the resource, because some vendors don't work with proxy authentication or don't work with IP authentication, so you have to do it a certain way. So I'm going to go through the authentication methods and show a couple of examples as well. So the four we're going to talk about, and there are probably more than this, but I think these are the four biggest, are referring URL, username and password, IP authentication, and proxy server. And like I said, often multiple authentication methods are going to be used by every library. And there are different limitations and like sort of pros and cons for each authentication method, depending on which you use. All right, so to start with, let's look at referring URL. So this method is basically going to authenticate the person from the page they're using to access the link. So in this scenario, you have to click on the resource link from a certain page on the web, and only clicks that come from that certain page are going to be granted access to the resource. So this obviously is not a perfect solution. Users cannot bookmark direct links. You can't embed a link on a LibGuide or something like that. They all have to go through this certain page. So this isn't a great solution, but we have one that uses this.
We have one from the library, it's called LexiComp, it's a nursing resource, and they actually, their own technology on their end really goofed with the IP authentication. So the only way that we can authenticate all the nursing students on campus for their product is through referring URL. The other thing that you might recognize is the new gratis databases available to library school students. Those are hosted on a library wiki, on a library school wiki. And those resources are authenticated through the wiki webpage. The other part that's important is often you get to these web pages after you've signed in somehow else. So the referring URL is basically saying, we accept that you're authenticating a different way or through a firewall of some kind so that you get access to these types of things.
Yeah, and I just want to show, for example, the way we kind of get around it so it's a little bit easier than just saying like everyone has to go to this page. So we're still linking to this database LexiComp in our A to Z list here. So if you click on it, it directs you to that password protected resources page I was just showing, and then you have to authenticate using your Simmons username and password. Then you can click on LexiComp from here. So it's less direct, but it's still, at least we're able to sort of put it in the places where you would expect to find a link to LexiComp. So that is referring URL. The next one is username and password. So this is going to be for a specific resource. The resource is requiring you to enter a username and password. And that username and password is the same for all users of the group you're looking to provide access to. So this is again problematic. It's not the same as your personal like Simmons username and password. It's going to be something you're going to have to protect in some way because you can't just like put it on your website because then anyone in the world can get the username and password. So you need a secure way to be able to share the username and password for the specific resource. And it's also difficult if and when, and it always happens, if the username and password are updated because people have saved it, but sometimes the vendor wants to change it once a year or something like that. And if I go back to our password protected resources page, you can see we do have a few that require a shared username and password. So we're not able to use the other authentication methods that we use at Simmons. And there was one you were talking about.
Yeah.
Simmons.
Against the Grain. Has anybody in library, so this is a library school resource, and it's actually built on a WordPress site. So there is no other authentication method available. You have to use a username and password. And I know that students are using it because once or twice a semester, I get a report that the username and password doesn't work. And then I have to contact Against the Grain, and because they have, I think they're run by volunteers, they take a while to get back to me. So it's not ideal, but sometimes it's the only thing available. Or sometimes it's the most affordable, and that's the only thing you can afford.
So that's referring URL and username and password. So the next two we're going to talk about are the primary ways we use at Simmons to authenticate users. Whenever possible, these are the ways we want to use. And the first is IP authentication. So basically, the user is authenticated based on their IP address. Does everyone know what an IP address is? All right, so for example, at Simmons, every computer you use, even if you're on Wi-Fi, if you are on the Simmons network, your IP address is going to start with 134.140. So it can be any combination of the numbers 0 to 255 in the last two octets. I can't remember what they're called, but so an IP address generally is going to be, so all Simmons IPs start with 134.140. And then the way we denote that it can be anything afterwards is usually just star, or just 134.140 ... So that means any person coming from a 134.140 IP address is going to automatically be authenticated to use that resource. And whenever we set up a new resource, we have to let the vendor know this is our IP range. Anyone coming from these gets automatic access. So that's why if you're on campus and you're using a library resource, you're never asked to log in via that username and password page. It just knows you're on campus and sends you right through. Any questions about that? Do you have a comment? No. You looked like you had something to say. I was wondering.
Updating pages.
Oh, yes. The other thing that is a little bit of a catch, and I'll explain more too when we talk about proxy authentication, if your proxy server, which we're going to talk about next, is not on campus, that also needs to be included in your range. So, for instance, we used to have a proxy server that was hosted offsite, so it wasn't on our campus database. It didn't have an IP address 134.140, meaning when someone tried to authenticate through the proxy server, it was saying the proxy server doesn't have this address, no, we're not going to let them through. So if your proxy server IP address does not have the same beginning as your campus range or whatever range you're using, you need to also make sure the vendors know that let traffic through who is authenticating through the proxy server.
And that is a very specific, that does not have any wildcards in it. That should be a specific server number.
Yep. All right, and the last authentication method we're gonna talk about, which is the most complex, so we have pictures, is proxy authentication. So this is a diagram of basic internet traffic that I found on the web, and it just kind of explains the process, the regular process if you were gonna go to like Amazon. So you'd be sitting at a computer, you type in Amazon.com, it's going to look up that web address in the DNS, the name server. Then that request is going to go to the hosting server, so to Amazon's hosting server, and then it's going to send you back Amazon.com. And that's basically how internet traffic works for the most part. With a proxy server, it's going to be a little bit different. So first off, the links are gonna look different. So instead of just going to jstore.org/search, the library is going to provide you with this proxy link. So we have a lot of questions at the reference desk sometimes if people search for JSTOR in Google from home, and they click on JSTOR, and they're like, I'm at Simmons, I'm trying, and then JSTOR gives them sign in with your username and password, but that's specific to JSTOR. It's not talking to Simmons at all. What we need people to do is go to JSTOR through this proxy link when they're accessing from home. And this extra information is going to look different depending on what product you have for your proxy. So we have Easy Proxy. That is sort of the industry standard. We used to have III, their proxy product, so our links used to look different. They used to have like 0- something something library.simmons.edu. So depending on what proxy product you have, the links will look different. So what this does to the process is when it goes to the name server, it's having that information in there for Easy Proxy. The proxy server is going to sort of insert itself in the process, and it's going to trigger due to that extra information that was in the link. So it's sending you to the proxy instead of directly to the hosting server. And right there, it's going to stop you and ask you to authenticate in some way. At Simmons, we use the Simmons username and password. Some other libraries, it might be your library card, your barcode. You might have an ID number. It can be different from place to place, but in some way, it's going to ask you to authenticate, usually in a login screen. Once you authenticate successfully, then it's going to send back the information, usually the default home screen. It also might change the link a little bit, like Annie was saying, watch the links. That's also important for this process. So you can see how it goes from, you know, the Easy Proxy link and then sends you to the resource link. Okay, and again, like I said before, the proxy server might be set up to let certain users pass through without authenticating if certain criteria are met. So like we were talking about, we also have IP authentication. We say in our Easy Proxy setup, anyone with the IP address 134.140 **, don't put up the login screen. We already know they're fine. You don't need to authenticate them. And most proxy products have the ability to do this kind of thing. So you can say, like, don't worry about this set of people. We already know they're fine. The other option too is if you are accessing a resource using a VPN. So Simmons offers a virtual private network. I think it's called Checkpoint. The old one was AnyConnect. The new one is Checkpoint. I think. Checkpoint. When you set up Checkpoint on your computer, it basically makes your home computer act as a Simmons computer. So all of your traffic is going through the Simmons network. So it knows already you don't need to authenticate. So those are two different ways you might sort of bypass the proxy server. And when you click on, it's another watch the link thing, if you click on an Easy Proxy link on campus, you'll just see it just completely drops the Easy Proxy stuff from the link and just directs you straight to jstore.org/search. Okay, so any questions about this? This is kind of complicated. Any comments from things you've noticed using databases on campus? Or?
I've seen a couple of other authentication methods too. I think you're more likely to see them in public libraries when it's geographic. sort of any computer that's within, say, a city or within a state that has access to a resource will automatically have access to it.
Yep.
And then the other is sort of vendor-side authentication. You provide the vendor with information like your library barcode prefix, and they would allow anyone who signs in with a barcode that has that prefix into the resource.
Yeah, geo-authentication is, I mean, that's predominantly how public libraries authenticate through like Gale and large databases. And the way that actually works is Gale and the Mass College, so MBLC, which pays for all the public library resources in this state, they pay a third-party vendor that has a database of all the IP addresses within the state of Massachusetts. So it's thinking about the geolocation. And you can do that for the city of Cambridge. I think it goes down to the zip code, I think. So that's basically how that works. They pay a third-party vendor to say, these are all the IP addresses that you should allow, and then they all connect. Yeah. We have a little bit more time, so I was going to show serial solutions, if people have time for that. Again, we currently don't have serial solutions. We migrated away from that resource. But it is a pretty standard, it's pretty standard knowledge base, so I wanted to share that. Okay. So this is what the console looks like, and SFX will look different. Again, it's just jargon, so don't be intimidated, you'll be fine. All right, so you can see already that you can kind of see the structure, right? We've got provider, which is the vendor, you've got database name, and you can see the titles. And you can see kind of 17 of 500, 2 of 30, that's how many titles we have turned on in the knowledge base for that database. So I'm going to do a search. So I'm going to search for a provider. And I'm going to look for Mary Ann Liebert. It's easy to find because it's just one publisher. But she has 8. This company has 8 databases available. Now, you can choose. Sometimes these are really connected with specific databases, like Lisa or Lista or PubMed or something like that, something you'll recognize. But sometimes you don't get all of the journals within that database, so you have to turn on just the few titles that you want in that database. In order to keep things clean, if you order in individual titles from a provider, pick a database that has all those journals in it. You don't want to be picking willy-nilly, in the database. Also, if you have a journal and it can be offered in 2 places, you need to activate it in the knowledge base from where you're purchasing it. Okay? So even if I got these journals, but I got them from another provider, from, let's just say, Sage. That doesn't really work because you can only get it here, but there are some titles that you can get from multiple places, and you want to make sure that you're activating these resources in the knowledge base from who you're purchasing it from, because that's how you are authenticating. They know that you buy these things. Okay, so I'm going to choose the most generic one. Yep, go ahead.
So that's why you buy Windows over from a company that you buy databases from, so you have to go through the menu and turn them all on?
Sometimes. Actually, for us specifically, yes. But sometimes not. So for example, SFX is from a company called Ex Libris, and they don't own any journals or databases. They're not on the publishing side. They're not on the full text side. But they're one of the primary, link resolvers in the field. So you do have to turn on all of those resources yourself.
It's also not crawling the actual data you're getting. It got it from the knowledge base in this product is everything that the person writing, or the provider could get their hands on, and you're just turning things on and off.
That's right.
You're
Yep,
not
so-
crawling your own stuff.
Nope, this knowledge base is here. The companies created it. I'm just going in and turning the things on that I know we own or want. So for example, if something that we want, such as the journal Weave, which Amy just published in, is so new that it's not in the knowledge base, I'm going to add it to the knowledge base manually. So you can do that. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the list of titles. And this can get really lengthy. Serial Solutions it's a little bit clunky here, but you'll see that these are all of the titles that we have here. And it's really important to keep this up to date. So often, because this is connected to your A to Z list and showing your end patrons what you have. So this is a little bit ironic because we don't actually have this journal. We have 2 other journals that are not actually activated. So we're going to deactivate this title and activate the other 2. So to deactivate, I'm going to select on here, and I'm going to say edit, and I'm just going to say not tracked, and save. And then you do that the same way for the other titles. So we can go back and select the actual titles. Let's see. Let me go back, databases. So at each level I'm activating. I'm saying Marianne Liebert, turn on. Database, turn on. And then I'm going to go into I can say add all titles, or I can add them individually. Amy.
What if you pay for 2 databases and you have 2 of the same journals that you're paying for? Like you get Lisa and I'm just spitballing.
Yep.
Lisa and Libraries and Information and Science Source.
Yep.
And you get library technology reports through both of those.
Yep, I'll show you a great
Do
example.
you turn them on in both places?
You do. You turn them on in both places. Chronicle of Phil.
And then when you go to the link resolver, you might see the general shop here.
Yep. Okay. What is it?
Library technology reports.
Okay, it's gonna think about it. Okay, yeah, so in our knowledge base, we've turned on all of these databases, and it might be tricky to see with that sign, but you can see that we get this journal from several different places. Now, it can be confusing for end users, so sometimes I like to limit how many get shown, and then you can get fancy. You can basically prioritize things. You can say, if we have it from another vendor, don't show the Gale vendors, things like that. You can get more complex. Do you have any questions? Yeah, Jay.
I'm wondering, are you able to export your access data from a knowledge base, say that you're switching up resolvers, or if you're using other projects that have a knowledge base?
Sometimes, yeah. We can, in most cases, you can export your activated resources from your knowledge base. I think it just depends on what metadata you're going to be able to take with you. So Maybe.
Okay, so something you might not have to reactivate everything by hand.
That's right.
Okay.
And we switched systems because when we were evaluating the two, it was actually going to be more work to clean this up than to start fresh. So, and I think from the feedback I've gotten since I started working here that access to electronic resources are much better. Do you think that's true? Okay. Yeah. It's much more consistent. We're showing the end patron what we actually have. So, yeah. Okay, I think that's it. Does anybody else have any questions? There are more advanced things like dates of coverage and things like that, but if you want to talk about that, we can get into that offline. Maybe?
I have a question for you.
Oh, okay.
Not for the general.
Okay.
Did everyone sign the little post-it to get the slides? Oh, okay.
Thanks everybody for coming.